All right. So I've been on this consequences of capitalism kick, and I'm not even quite sure how I came to think of this, but I found myself wondering, has Albert Einstein ever shared any thoughts on economics or our economic structures? And it wasn't just Einstein, it was kind of broadly some of the best thinkers. A pattern that I've noticed across the best thinkers in history is that they're very multidisciplinary in their thinking, and they're able to abstract ideas and apply them to different circumstances. And for something as consequential, at least in modern life, as economics, and in this case capitalism, I was like, there's no way that he doesn't have something. And so I looked into it, and I found this interesting essay, Einstein's Why Socialism, which kind of caught me off guard. And for a little bit of context, I believe that this is actually a post-World War I, pre-World War II essay. So it's just an interesting point in time essay, and wanted to provide that context as well. But I'm going to go through this, kind of just go through it and share some thoughts along the way. So he starts off by introducing this idea of the predatory phase of human development. He attributes that to Thorstein Veblen, and that the real purpose of socialism is precisely to overcome and advance beyond the predatory phase of human development. And economic science in its present state can throw a little bit light on the socialist society of the future. And then he gets into this idea that socialism is directed towards a social ethical end. And science, however, cannot create ends, and even less instill them in human beings. Science at most can supply the means by which to attain certain ends. But the ends themselves are conceived by personalities with lofty ethical ideals, and if these ends are not stillborn but vital and vigorous, are adopted and carried forward by those many human beings who half unconsciously determine the slow evolution of society. And so I want to pause and focus in on his emphasis of the ends here, because something that capitalism lacks is an endpoint and a definite, distinct aim at something. Because ultimately, in the kind of pure capitalistic objective to obtain profit, the end point of obtaining profit is more profit. And so in that sense, there's really no aim, no true aim. And how long can you sustain a system like that, where there's not really a purpose that you're striving toward, other than selfish, kind of individually focused objectives? So that is I think the distinction to be made, and one thing to take away is whatever we decide to do or what the future holds, it needs to be directed at some sort of end point, an aim, whether that's an ideal or virtue or whatever it might be. For these reasons, we should be on guard not to overestimate science and scientific methods when it is a question of human problems. And we should not assume that experts are the only ones who have a right to express themselves on questions affecting the organization of society. And so this comes after he had sort of humbly acknowledged, like, I'm an astrophysicist, like, am I really qualified to speak to this? And the short answer is, like, yeah, like, when it comes to the organization of society, there needs to be alternative perspectives and all different kinds of inputs to round out the human experience, to more adequately address the issues that humans experience. So this is a very human problem, and math and science can't quite capture the needs in addressing those things. So for these reasons, innumerable voices have been asserting for some time now that human society is passing through a crisis, that its stability has been gravely shattered. It is characteristic of such a situation that individuals feel indifferent or even hostile toward the group, small or large, to which they belong. Man is at one and the same time a solitary being and a social being, and that's a huge thing. I got super excited when I saw that for the first time. Very often, or almost exclusively, I think most people will have heard the quote, man is a social creature. Humans are a social creature, or humans are a social species. But we really do have a solitary element to humanity. And I think solitude is a critical part of developing as an individual. It helps you become an individual within the society. So he goes on to say that as a solitary being, he attempts to protect his own existence and that of those who are closest to him, to satisfy his personal desires and to develop his innate abilities. So solitude helps you, protect your own existence, but also to develop and grow. It's something that I believe to be true, that in order to experience or to achieve that individual personal growth and development, like, you need solitude in order to do that. Self-reflection, kind of understanding you as an individual outside of the context of society and things like that. But then as a social being, he seeks to gain the recognition and affection of his fellow human beings, to share in their pleasure, to comfort them in their sorrows, and to improve their conditions of life, which again is a very natural experience. And this is what is commonly addressed when people say, humans are a social creature. Only the existence of these varied, frequently conflicting strivings accounts for the special character of a man, and their specific combination determines the extent to which an individual can achieve their inner equilibrium and can contribute to the well-being of society. So it's this balance, this kind of harmony between solitude and society, having that ability to kind of withdraw, work on yourself, and then take this improved version back into society to help contribute in a meaningful way. So it is quite possible that the relative strength of these two drives is, in the main, fixed by inheritance, that there are inherent kind of parts of your nature. But the personality that finally emerges is largely formed by the environment in which a person happens to find themselves during their development, by the structure of the society in which they grow up, and by the tradition of that society, and by its appraisal of particular types of behavior. So while we do have inherent natural tendencies and there are kind of inherent natural elements of who we are, our environment is the nature versus nurture conversation here, and the answer being that both contribute to who you become. But importantly, and this is something that I've been noticing come up in a few different things, notably in public opinion, it's the structure of the society. Like, the way that the society is structured is going to influence how you operate within that society, and it's going to help shape who you are. The traditions of that society, the culture, the celebrations, kind of, the traditions, right? But also, and one that I would place a lot of emphasis on, is the things that society or culture praises behaviorally, the behavioral standards of that society. What is considered the ideal version in that of a person in that society. So the abstract concept society means to the individual human being the sum total of his direct and indirect relations to his contemporaries and to all the people of earlier generations. The individual is able to think, feel, strive, and work by himself, but he depends so much upon society in his physical, intellectual, and emotional existence that it is impossible to think of him or to understand him outside the framework of society. It is society which provides man with food, clothing, a home, the tools of work, language, the forms of thought, and most of the content of thought. His life is made possible through the labor and the accomplishments of the many millions past and present, who are all hidden behind the small word society. There's a lot that you could unpack in this, but I think that he captures it very nicely, that if you consider the way that we, think of how you interact with the world around you day to day, very few have what it takes to exist totally outside of society. To be able to provide food, clothing, home, tools, thought, independent of us, outside of society. That'd be very, very hard. So it's evident that there is a dependence of the individual upon society. And that's not something that we can kind of walk back on. So and he says, just as in the case of ants and bees. However, while the whole life process of ants and bees is fixed down to the smallest detail by rigid hereditary instincts, the social pattern and interrelationships of human beings are very variable and susceptible to change. So because of our capacity, our consciousness, right, our capacity to think and make choices, and that just creates so many variables in life that instinct alone will not be enough for us to survive. So we acquire this biological constitution, which we must consider as fixed and unalterable. Things like your physical makeup and certain qualities, I'll say, but not all of them. These natural urges, but in addition to this, humans acquire a cultural constitution, which they adopt through communication and through many other types of influences. So if we ask ourselves how the structure of society and the cultural attitude of man should be changed in order to make human life as satisfying as possible, we should constantly be conscious of the fact that there are certain conditions which we are unable to modify. And I love the way that he frames the situation here, which is how we structure society in order to make human life as satisfying as possible. Shouldn't that be the objective, right? As opposed to, again, consequences of capitalism, as opposed to capitalism, which really doesn't have an aim other than acquiring money, right? Like, what are we striving toward? What are we working toward? As a country, like, what's our objective? It's not even very clear right now. So I like the idea of striving toward this thought, and this thought is awesome because it's durable. It has the longevity, right? It's a question that you're continuously asking yourself, how do we improve? We can always improve, and it's rooted in making life as satisfying as possible. And there's a little bit of a hang up right now because I know people will be, there's a counter to like satisfying, like, oh, you just don't, like, what, you're just not going to work or whatever. That's not really the point. It's work worth doing. It's allowing people, it's true freedom. It's, I don't know. It's more open, less contained. I don't know. So, as mentioned before, the biological nature of man is, for all practical purposes, not subject to change. Furthermore, technological and demographic developments of the last few centuries have created conditions which are here to stay. This has only become even crazier, the technological and demographic developments. Permanent changes, radically different, right? So in relatively densely settled populations with the goods which are indispensable to their continued existence, an extreme division of labor and a highly centralized productive apparatus are absolutely necessary. The time, which looking back seems so idyllic, is gone forever, when individuals or relatively small groups could be completely self-sufficient. It is only a slight exaggeration to say that mankind constitutes, even now, a planetary community of production and consumption. Which, all of this totally makes sense. Like, one of the things that's been very exposed in, let's say, in a current events example, well, I'm not even going to go there. Just our global network and the way that we are so deeply entangled economically in this global perspective. Like, we really are a planetary community. So then he gets into the point where he may indicate briefly what constitutes the essence of the crisis of our time. It concerns the relationship of the individual to society. The individual has become more conscious than ever of his dependence upon society, but he does not experience this dependence as a positive asset, as an organic tie, as a protective force, but rather as a threat to his natural rights, or even to his economic existence. His position in society is such that the egotistical drives of his makeup are constantly being accentuated, while his social drives, which are by nature weaker, progressively deteriorate. All human beings, whatever their position in society, are suffering from this process of deterioration. Unknowingly prisoners of their own egotism, they feel insecure, lonely, and deprived of the naive, simple, and unsophisticated enjoyment of life. Man can find meaning in life, short and perilous as it is, only through devoting himself to society. Power, that's a big point right there. And this is exactly, I agree. This relationship between the individual and society is the big crisis that we are facing. And unfortunately, we are more aware than ever how dependent we are on everything. Yet it's as if that dependence is almost intentionally being exploited at this point, I would say. But even if you don't agree with that, then maybe unconsciously there's this feeling, this dissatisfaction, like the structures around us, they don't feel safe. They don't feel like we can depend on them, and they don't feel very connective. It feels very disconnected. Individuals, we're becoming increasingly more isolated. So, yeah. The economic anarchy of capitalist society as it exists today is, in my opinion, the real source of the evil. We see before us a huge community of producers, the members of which are unceasingly striving to deprive each other of the fruits of their collective labor, not by force, but on the whole in faithful compliance with legally established rules. In this respect, it is important to realize that the means of production, that is to say, the entire productive capacity that is needed for producing consumer goods, as well as additional capital goods, may legally be, and for the most part are, the private property of individuals. So this goes back to the thought that I've had, like the objective of capitalism is to obtain profit, right? And profit is inherently selfish. It requires that you receive more than you in turn provide. And at scale, that's a huge problem, because if every individual in an economic system is operating in a way that they're trying to maximize the amount that they receive while minimizing the amount that they provide, of course that's going to create conflicts. And it pits every individual against each other in competition. It becomes even more complex when you introduce corporations, which are now also competing with individuals for that limited supply of currency. So for the sake of simplicity, in the discussion that follows, I shall call workers all those who do not share in the ownership of the means of production, although this does not quite correspond to the customary use of the term. The owners of the means of production is in a position to purchase the labor power of the worker. This is the corporation, right? Or, the business owner. They purchase the production of employees. By using the means of production, the worker produces new goods, which become the property of the capitalists. So the only true actual capitalists are the people that own the businesses, own the capital, right? And so the workers, the essential point about this process is the relation between what the worker produces and what he is paid, both measured in terms of real value. Insofar as the labor contract is free, What the worker receives is determined not by the real value of the goods he produces, but by his minimum needs and the capitalist's requirements for labor power in relation to the number of workers competing for jobs. It is important to understand that even in theory, the payment of the worker is not determined by the value of his product. So this goes back to the fundamental idea that the labor involved in producing a good or service is the real value of the thing. It's the actual value of it. It's the closest that we can come. And in corporate structures, it totally divorces it totally divorces us from the real value. And we'll get into that. Private capital tends to become concentrated in few hands, partly because of competition among the capitalists, and partly because technological development and the increasing division of labor encourage the formation of larger units of production at the expense of smaller ones. This is one that I focus on a ton. Like technological advances, the increasing division of labor, this hyper-specialized environment that we're in. It creates larger units of production, bigger factories, more hands in that process doing smaller and smaller, more specialized roles. And that comes at the expense of lots of smaller operations doing that work. The result of these developments is an oligarchy of private capital, the enormous power of which cannot be effectively checked even by a democratically organized political society. This is true since the members of legislative bodies are selected by political parties largely financed or otherwise influenced by private capitalists who, for all practical purposes, separate the electorate from the legislature. The consequence is that the representatives of the people do not, in fact, sufficiently protect the interests of the underprivileged sections of the population. Moreover, under existing conditions, private capitalists inevitably control, directly or indirectly, the main sources of information: press, radio, education. It is thus extremely difficult, and indeed in most cases quite impossible, for the individual citizen to come to objective conclusions and to make intelligent use of his political rights. Huge. This is the bulk. This is the main thing that I want to capture. Capitalism, seeking profit, it's based on currency, right? There's a limited supply of currency in market. It makes sense when it's just the individuals involved, but when you introduce corporations that act as individuals, they act as humans, right? They're now sucking like vacuums, sucking up pools of the limited currency in circulation. This allows them to grow bigger, to have more offerings, right? And to acquire more of the technology and resources. And it creates this centralized, concentrated oligarchy of capitalists. That's why we've seen the increased inequality today. That's fewer capitalists actually participating in capitalism as they are acquiring more and more of the share of the pie. And the technology is a huge piece too, because all of the efficiency increases of that technology, it's not going to making the work easier so that the employees can breathe a little bit, get some more breathe. No, it goes to just allowing them to do more. And so it becomes more and more and more for the employee. They do more in the same amount of time for the same amount of pay. And so the benefits are hoarded by the executives or the company as a whole. So, and then of course that gets into, right, like, even if we recognize this, the capitalists are, they're lobbying, right? The businesses and the individuals lobbying for their interests. And so the support, the protections for the people, the employees, is just not there. And notably that the part on the capitalists directly or indirectly controlling the main sources of information, like our news is owned by private, people and entities, right? And so they're filtering the message and pumping out, right, what reinforces the kind of official line of the capitalist mindset. And so that's part of the challenge, is the average person has to take on a research project, an intense research project, and jump through a ton of hoops just to get to the truth of a situation, to even understand this. And that's why so many people just accept our current situation as somehow the best version, even though it's clearly not. So production is carried on for profit, not for use. This is important because in kind of the initial versions of trade, it was based on utility, like what you needed, how useful these goods or services were to you. Now it's for profit, not for use or utility. There's no provision that all those able and willing to work will always be in a position to find employment, and an army of unemployed almost always exists. The worker is constantly in fear of losing his job. Since unemployed and poorly paid workers do not provide a profitable market, the production of consumers' goods is restricted, and great hardship is the consequence. Technological progress frequently results in more unemployment rather than in easing of the burden of work for all. This is what I was trying to get at before. The profit motive, in conjunction with competition among capitalists, is responsible for an instability in the accumulation and utilization of capital, which leads to increasingly severe depressions. Unlimited competition leads to a huge waste of labor, and to that crippling of the social consciousness of individuals, which I mentioned before. So, again, technological progress, it eliminates jobs, because from the business perspective, they're just going to try to operate as efficiently as possible. It goes back to that inherent selfishness, right? Maximizing what you get while providing as little as possible. And so tech comes in, it can replace the human, and the human is now an unneeded, unnecessary expense. And so on top of this is that we're producing for profit. And so there's a huge amount of labor that's just wasted. Like we're producing in excess. So this crippling of individuals, I consider the worst evil of capitalism. Our whole educational system suffers from this evil. An exaggerated competitive attitude is inculcated into the student, who is trained to worship acquisitive success as a preparation for his future career. I've mentioned basically exactly this, like this really destructive form of competition is the attitude, and it's like we indoctrinate our children into believing this thing. They're trained to worship this acquisition, the acquisitive success, as a preparation for his future career. And that's he's speaking to that as its effect on the educational system. And just consider the way that we view education today is definitely, we view it through this, like, it will get you a job. It's like training for a job, which it shouldn't be. I'm convinced that there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an educational system which would be oriented toward social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and are utilized in a planned fashion. A planned economy which adjusts production to the needs of the community would distribute the work to be done among all those able to work and would guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. The education of the individual, in addition to promoting his own innate abilities, would attempt to develop in him a sense of responsibility for his fellow men in place of the glorification of power and success in our present society. Like, just think about the dynamics of our focus is on power, success, money, right? Is that really, those are the aspirations we really want? Because you can achieve, the thing about that is you can achieve somewhat the same objectives or the same things through a more socially centered outlook. How do we maximize, like, the human experience during our time here? And so education, just like being a very individualized education, it is necessary to remember that a planned economy is not yet socialism. A planned economy, as such, may be accompanied by the complete enslavement of the individual. The achievement of socialism requires the solution of some extremely difficult socio-political problems. How is it possible, in view of the far-reaching centralization of political and economic power, to prevent bureaucracy from becoming all-powerful and overweening? How can the rights of the individual be protected and therewith a democratic counterweight to the power of bureaucracy be assured? Clarity about the aims and problems of socialism is of greatest significance in our age of transition, since under present circumstances, free and unhindered discussion of these problems has come under a powerful taboo. I consider the foundation of this magazine to be an important public service. And that's what I have. I definitely left out some nuggets of that essay, but those are big things. And so again, he comes back to what I had mentioned right off. I keep coming back to this idea of, like, what are we striving toward? You know, what is our objective? Because it's too lazy and it's irresponsible to take that capitalist mindset of, like, don't think about it too much. It's just about acquiring money. If you acquire money and power, that's all you need. Instead, you know, especially in considering the backdrop of today, humanitarian crisis, climate change being a huge issue, and honestly, I don't see us being able to tackle that issue unless either we direct capitalism toward that aim, or we take a more social view, a formal social process to this outlook to it, and our aims being toward empowering individuals, trying to, instead of maximizing profit, maximizing the human experience, making it as great of an experience during our time here for as many people as we possibly can, and trying to live harmoniously with every other country, culture on the planet, as well as the natural environment of the planet. I don't know, so interesting. Just like Einstein talked about socialism. And again, like I don't know that this is necessarily the way to go, but the problems addressed here, they are the problems. Like, and so whether or not socialism is the answer, I don't know yet. But we've outlined the problems, we can identify them, we just need to find the right solution.